Vayhi erev vayvoker yom hashishi, vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz, v'chol tzevam, vayichal Elohim bayom hashevi, melachto asher asa, vayishpot Bayom HaShevi'i mikol melachto asher asa. Vayivarech Elohim et Yom HaShevi'i, vayikadesh oto, ki vo Shabbat mikol melachto, ki vo Shabbat mikol melachto. Asher bara, Asher bara, Asher bara, Elohim la'asot. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth with all of their array. God had finished on the seventh day his work that he had made, and then he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. God gave the seventh day his blessing, and he hallowed it, for on it he ceased from all his work that by creating God had made. Good day. I am Rabbi Robbie Harris, and I welcome you to this first video cast of our course. We are studying, as you know, Shabbat, from here to eternity. The words and melody I have just chanted are well known to many of you as the introduction to the Shabbat evening Kiddush, sung for thousands of years in Jewish households on Friday evenings, all over the world, up to including our very day and age. But to truly understand Shabbat, we really ought not begin with the liturgy of Shabbat. The beautiful prayers and songs of Shabbat were composed centuries after Shabbat was first observed in ancient Israel. Even the words I have just sung have a different resonance when the melody used is not the familiar chant of the home or synagogue service sung out of the prayer book or the Siddur, but rather the chant of the Torah reader who follows the Masoretic Ta'amei HaMikra or trope of the words in their biblical context. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Listen as I chant the words again, this time from a Tanakh or Bible. Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tzevam, vayichal Elohim bayom hashevi'i, melachto asher asa, vayishpot bayom hashevi'i mikol melachto asher asa, vayivarech Elohim et yom hashevi'i, vayikadesh oto, ki vo Shabbat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot. Now it is true that even this melody is not truly biblical. The Masoretes, who punctuated the Bible, were Jewish scribal scholars of the 6th to 8th centuries CE of the Common Era. They added vowels and accents and other punctuation to the biblical text, and they wrote extensive notes and guides to the proper presentation and punctuation of our sacred scriptures. But as old as these accents are, they were still composed hundreds of years after the texts making up the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, were completed and canonized. So what we want to do is make a distinction between the Shabbat as we imagine it from our homes, our memories of perhaps grandparents, the old country on the one hand, and Shabbat as we can learn about it from the Bible and the literature and history of the ancient Near East on the other. This is the first task of our course. Put differently, There is a difference between the way we observe and celebrate Shabbat today and the way our ancestors did in ancient times. That there is such a difference between then and now may surprise some of us. After all, do Jews today not venerate the Torah as much as our people always have done? And the answer is, of course we do. The love we feel for the Torah, the joy that we feel when performing the mitzvot, the commandments, what the rabbis call simcha shel mitzvah, the joy when we perform a commandment, the seriousness with which we approach our sacred obligations as Jews, all of these are the same or analogous to the way our ancestors felt, and our sense of commitment builds on theirs and develops from theirs. In particular, we need to recognize the distinction between pshat and drash, between pshat, which is the original or contextual meaning of the Torah, and drash, the religious meaning discovered in Torah and developed from Torah by the ancient rabbis. Another way of expressing this distinction between pshat and drash is by considering the different ways we would answer the question, what does the Bible mean? And what did the Bible mean? This is a question posed by the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr many years ago. And as you may remember from our first meeting, when it wasn't a virtual meeting, when I was actually in Baltimore, the attitude we hope to display as we answer these questions, again, what does the Bible mean versus what did the Bible mean? The way we want to answer those questions is the way expressed by Rashbam, Rabbi Samuel ben Meir, one of the grandsons of the great Rashi in the 12th century of northern France. Recall his explanation of the difference between pshat and drash. And here I quote from Rashbam's biblical commentary to the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, or Exodus chapter 21. He writes, I have come to explain the pshat, the contextual meaning of Scripture. And I will do this even though the rabbinic understanding of the halachot of Jewish law is the essence. This references the concept of drash, although to be sure he does not employ the root here. As the rabbis taught, halacha uproots Scripture. Now remember, as we saw last week, when Rashbam says halacha uproots Scripture, he is citing a teaching of the Babylonian Talmud. It means that we practice Judaism, worship as Jews, and believe in Judaism as the rabbis taught us to practice, to worship, and to believe. Whereas when we study about Judaism or about the Bible, we employ the methodology of pshat to understand things in their original historical context. This is Talmud Torah Lishma, the study of Torah for its own sake, and we do not necessarily need it to be connected with our practices or our beliefs. As we begin our journey of exploring Shabbat from here to eternity, we will first explore the biblical context of Shabbat in order to better appreciate the Shabbat that we already know and love. So first, let's think of the word Shabbat, and let's think of the three letters Shin, Bet, Tav, the root letters of the verb in biblical Hebrew, meaning to cease or come to an end. Because in the Bible, both are important, both verbs and nouns. As we try to understand what Shabbat was in the Bible, we need to understand how the Bible itself expresses the concept of cessation in terms of a verb, a happening, or the noun, a festival occasion like Shabbat, something we celebrate. Okay? So both are built in, and we'll need to reference both of them. Now, different biblical scholars have a different attitude towards how we use knowledge gained from archaeology and the study of ancient Near Eastern literatures, how we apply that knowledge gained through modern study to our understanding of sacred scriptures. So in one sense, we're on safe ground here. There is no Shabbos, there is no Shabbat, right, in the ancient Near East other than in Israel. Later on in our course, we'll be talking about Shabbat as it emerges in the ancient world into the consciousness of non-Jews, like Greeks and Romans, as they hear about it, and then still later as the Christian world adopts the institution of Shabbat for their own religion. But in the days of the Bible, only the biblical Israelites had a Shabbat. However, there is one concept in ancient Near Eastern literature expressed in the language of Akkadian, or the language of Akkad, or Assyria, an ancient Semitic language which predates biblical Hebrew by at least 1,000 years. There's at least one concept which some scholars like to look at as sort of a biblical, sort of a backdrop to the biblical concept of Shabbat. And that is the word I have to look up. My Akkadian is not as good as it was in graduate school. An Akkadian noun, Shabbatu, or Shapatu. Now, this refers to the 15th day of the month. So the ancient Assyrian Shapatu was an unlucky day. Whenever it was determined by the various priests and scribes of their culture, if you had a Shapatu coming up, you didn't want to do anything that you needed to do, to have good business fortune or maybe a military adventure. You wanted to steer clear of the Shapatu. So some scholars in modern biblical scholarship will look at that day and find an antecedent or an anticipation of what becomes the biblical Shabbat. Other scholars say we can't really take that step because what the Shapatu was in ancient Akkadian culture, say in the second millennium BCE, has no verifiable connection to the biblical Shabbat. You're going to have to decide that one on your own. At any rate, again, let's get back to our nouns and verbs. So you have the verb vayishpot, for example, or vishavat, things came to an end. And it doesn't always happen in the Bible that these verbs come into connection to what you and I know as Shabbat. Even the biblical passage I read and chanted from the book of Genesis, chapters 2, 1 through 3, it doesn't have the noun Shabbat there. We sing that and we make the association between that section and Shabbat through the story that the Bible conveys. Vayivarech Elohim et Yom Hashvi v'kedesho kivo shavat mikom lachto. We know that God blesses the seventh day and sanctifies it because on it he ceased. Shavat. God ceased from all his labor that he had done to create the world. However, the biblical text often makes an intimate connection between the verb lishpot and the noun Shabbat, meaning the Sabbath. A great example of this is in Exodus chapter 16. Now, by the way, I'm throwing out these verses left and right here. If you're watching out there in TV land, what you really should be doing is pausing your video player and looking up these verses in your own Bible at home. Feel free to start and stop me as we go, because it's much better for you to be able to have the text at hand and even look a little fore and aft, look a little bit before and after the biblical citation. So I'm about to send you, for example, to Exodus chapter 16. Let's see, verse 30. Okay, so 16:30. So at this point, turn off your machine, go run and get your Tanakh. I don't care what translation you have, or if you're using the Hebrew original, and then go back, read it ahead of time, and then turn me back on. Okay, so I'm assuming you just did that. I'm going to be reading here from the Bible. Vayishbetu ha'am bayom hashvi'i, and the people, came to a cessation on the seventh day. Now, what does that mean? What's the context in the Bible? This, of course, is the story of the manna. The manna in the wilderness, the wonderful food that God provided for our ancestors as they wandered around the desert following the exodus from Egypt and until they got into the land of Israel. Now, our connection today with this story are the two chalot, or Sabbath loaves, if you don't know what challah is, on our Shabbat tables on Friday evening and Saturday during the day. We have 2 chalot. Why, you might ask, do we have 2 chalot? Of course you know the answer, I'm sure. Because 2 portions of manna fell on the 7th day. And it's in that connection, in Exodus chapter 16, that the text becomes relevant to our subject today. We want to understand, were they observing Shabbos, as you and I know, when they when the Israelites acted in this narrative, or were they doing something else? Let's take a look. Go back now to, I guess, the middle of chapter 16. You could probably pick it up on verse 11 or so, 16:11, and read down until you get to understanding the story as it's unfolding. But you see that the Israelites want to have food. God provides them food. But God doesn't want them to go out and gather the food on the 7th day. So he provides 2 portions of the manna on Friday, as it were, so that the Israelites would not have to work, quote unquote. Now that becomes a key concept. They were not supposed to go out and gather their food on the Shabbat, on the 7th day. So then, as you're reading from the beginning of the chapter, we'll focus on verse 23. Chapter 16, verse 23. Vayomer alehem hu asher diber Adonai, Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh Ladonai Machar. And he said to them, this is what Adonai has spoken. It will be a Shabbaton. There's the word, Shabbaton, a holy Shabbat unto the Lord, or unto Adonai, tomorrow. Blah, blah, blah. This is what you should do. So Moses is calling the day Shabbat, the day on which the Israelites are to cease gathering their manna. Now, as you've read through Exodus 16, the story of the manna, ask yourselves, does it look like they're observing Shabbat the way we are? What is the nature of the Shabbat that the Israelites follows? And in particular, here's a bold hint. Where are they lighting candles? Right? Are they lighting candles on Friday night? And in fact, they are not. There are no Shabbat lamps, not in this story, nor anywhere else in the Bible. Now, if you've fallen out of your chair, please pick yourself up and calm down. This is just one of the things, the many things that we will see, that we talked about last week and we'll talk about throughout the course, that are different between the way we observe Shabbat today and the way they did in the Bible. The rabbis, and when I say the rabbis, I mean the rabbis of the Talmud 2,000 years ago, are very well aware that this is a new thing that they are inventing or creating to observe Shabbat in their own day. If you feel like looking it up in the Babylonian Talmud, I'm thinking it's the treatise on Shabbat, page 23b, if you're scoring at home. They reference the bracha that we say both on Hanukkah lamps as well as Shabbat lamps. And we finish that bracha, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, Ladlik ner shel Shabbat, or Ladlik ner shel Hanukkah. And then the rabbis ask, Heichan tzivanu? Where was it that God, quote unquote, commanded us to light the Shabbat lamp, or the Hanukkah lamp for that matter? The answer we'll give you in a few weeks' time. What they said those rabbis did, but they were, for our purpose today, they were well aware that there were no Shabbat lamps being lit in the days of the Bible. But enough of the manna. Let's get to the heart of the matter. If you're considering Shabbat in the Torah, I could hear you asking, what about the so-called 10 Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, or Decalogue? And of course, that would be the next subject of our consideration. Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5 will be the operative texts. And this is the famous Shamor v'Zachor b'Dibur Echad, as we sing about it in Shabbat liturgy on Friday evening. We have in the Bible 2 versions of the Decalogue. In Exodus 20 is when it, quote unquote, actually happens. And in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses, for the new generation out there in the wilderness, recalls what happened when they went forth from Egypt. And there are distinctions to be made between the presentation of the Aseret HaDibrot, or Ten Commandments, in Exodus 20, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 5, in particular with regard to the fourth Dibra, the one about Shabbat. So we have Zachor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho in Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, or to make it holy. Whereas in Deuteronomy it is Shamor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as God, Adonai your God, has commanded you. Now, is there a real distinction between those two things? The rabbis certainly said there was, and Jewish law and practice, ever since the rabbis, has certainly sought to find in those variations distinct practices and beliefs about Shabbat that Jews are enjoined to respond to. The question is, what's the difference between remembering something and observing it? And that would be the biblical context. Now, we don't have Moses in the Torah saying, okay, Israelites, here I'm using the one word, here I'm using the other word, here's the distinction that No, it doesn't work like that in the Bible. So when one wants to consider the difference between Zachor, remember the Sabbath day, and Shamor, observe the Sabbath day, we might be led into thinking that the whole chapter is different. The whole presentation of the Torah is different in the two texts, when in fact there are things that really, really connect them. The main thing is you're not supposed to do any work on the seventh day, whether you're remembering or you're doing. Exodus has a reason for that, as the seventh day being built into the fabric of creation. Since God ceased his creative work on the seventh day, so too you should cease your creative work on the seventh day. Whereas Deuteronomy, giving you maybe perhaps what would be considered a more practical guide to observing the Shabbat, is you must stop working. Your slave, your animal, your household, everybody must work. And why? Because you remember what it was like to be a slave in the land of Egypt. And if you remember what ceaseless labor is like, you should take care that nobody, not you, not any member of your household, is subject to ceaseless labor. Even that person or that animal gets a break on Shabbat. When the Kohen Gadol, in his rites on Yom Kippur, the high priest on the Day of Atonement, finishing his priestly duties in the temple, he read to the people from the books of Leviticus and Numbers on about Yom Kippur. And he said, there's really much more written here than I can cover in one reading. I'm feeling the same way, not that I'm a Kohen Gadol. There are many more references in the Bible to Shabbat than we can possibly cover in one session. I think the verb Shabbat or Shavat occurs some 150 times in some manner or other, along with the nouns Shabbat, the Sabbath, in the Bible. So we're only going to be able to cover a precious few occasions. Next week we'll reference other biblical texts mentioning Shabbat, both from the prophets and the writings, and we'll try to get a sense in seeing what those texts have to say about Shabbat, how they will lead in to our next topic, which is mountains hanging by a thread, Shabbat in Talmud and Midrash, and understanding the transition from biblical Shabbat to a rabbinic Shabbat as found in the Talmud.